Okay, so welcome everybody to the Arizona PowerShell Users Group for February. This is February, isn't it? Okay.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, I want to turn the floor over to Tech Systems. They're, as always, they're great. Give us pizza every time and sponsors with their facilities. Can't say enough. So I'll let you have it.
Thanks. I'm glad you all can make it tonight. Yeah, welcome. We love having you all. We go around and tell everyone how we're honored that you guys get to use our facilities. But I recognize most of your faces, so you've probably heard my spiel. But we are the largest IT staffing and services company. We work with 90% of the Fortune 500 companies here in Phoenix, and we also have 100 offices nationwide. So we have visibility to opportunities nationwide. If you ever have any questions, curiosities about any positions that we have here, any companies we work with, even IT trends, companies hiring, or average pay rates, anything of that sort, we're here to help you out. This is my partner Nick. We both focus in the system space. From a Windows perspective, we do have a partner that's also a systems focused recruiter, but he's more on the Linux side. So we all kind of work together to divide and conquer.
Well, PowerShell runs on Linux now too.
Yeah, he definitely said he wants to come in here and check us out. They're at a meeting out of state this week, so we're a little bit.
And they didn't take you, huh?
Not this year. Next time. But yeah, cool. Well, thank you guys. My cards are here. If you need anything, reach out. I am actually dog sitting for one of our partners that's at the meeting, so I need to go let the dog out. But Nick will be here tonight.
Who let the dogs out?
So yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's right.
Cool. Well, you guys enjoy, and I will see you next month then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Hopefully everybody has heard of or has seen some of the posts or blog articles that Tim Warner has done. He is a Pluralsight author, and he's authored, 4 or 5 courses at least, Tim?
Actually, almost 40, I think. It's over 30.
Wow, I didn't know you had that many.
Yeah.
Wow. So he's going to speak tonight in lieu of Tom was going to speak this week, but he had some other things come up. So he's going to speak on the same topic, which is Azure Resource Manager templates. So I'll give you the floor, Tim. And thanks so much for being our speaker for this month.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me, and hello everybody from Nashville, Tennessee. I figure we'll go for about an hour or so, and then afterwards I'll stick around if you have questions, comments, concerns. But I do want to ask you right off the top that as I'm flapping my gums here, if you think of a question or if you want to know something more about what we're doing, please just stop me right in my tracks, okay? Because I'm going to probably be tunnel visioning on my main screen, and you're off on a second screen right now. So when Tom and I were first discussing this topic, I thought it was PowerShell in Azure, and he turned PowerShell into a verb. It seems like almost everything's a verb nowadays. So PowerShelling Azure. What does that mean exactly? What is this Azure Resource Manager template business all about? That's actually how I wanted us to start, just to briefly look at what the heck Azure Resource Manager is, how it's different from Azure V1 or Azure Service Management. The focus, though, of course, is PowerShell and how PowerShell fits into Azure Resource Manager. There's some gotchas and some little catch points that I want to make sure to get you past over the next hour. And of course, the centerpiece, I guess you'd say, are these deployment templates called ARM templates and how, again, those work with Windows PowerShell. So there you go for our agenda, pretty straightforward. The session materials, which include this PowerPoint deck in PDF format, I put together a links list, so any resource I show you when I bring over the browser, all of those links are in this repository. This timw.info/AZPosh actually redirects to my GitHub repository. And let's see, here it is right here. I've got a repo called User Groups, and in there's AZPosh 2017. And like I said, just the PowerShell script files, there's some Resource Manager template sample artifacts, the PDF, and the links list. So it's pretty straightforward, but it hopefully will help you in terms of applying what you might learn over the next hour. Just as a purely random note, I think I heard one or two people mention this weird globe object that I seem to be hiding behind. Just FYI, this is called the chaotic eyeball. A lot of Pluralsight authors use it because it's essentially a portable sound booth. You just basically pop it over your microphone, and it gives you really nice sound isolation. The only downside, as you can see, is that it blocks my view, and it can be a little awkward sometimes on webinars and stuff.
Can't see you right now.
Yeah, exactly. But the output is good, which is why I use it. Okay. What is Azure Resource Manager? First, I just put together a very quick laundry list of facts here. We're going to do a lot of demos, of course. I don't want you to fall asleep with slides. Nobody likes that. PowerPoint coma or something. There's a term for that. But Resource Manager is Microsoft's re-architecting of their deployment model. It was released in 2014, whereas Azure V1 or Service Management API was generally available in 2010. So I think, this is just me speaking here, I believe that Microsoft kind of took a leaf from Amazon and Amazon Web Services and started realizing, I think they might have some better ideas here than what we have. So they've re-architected Azure, and it really does look and act a heck of a lot like AWS. If you've used AWS, you can pretty much do one-to-one analogs for almost all of the services. It's pretty crazy. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, I guess. One of the big things that Microsoft fixed with ARM is instead of all of your assets just being in these separate buckets, and then, for instance, you'd create a virtual machine, and then when you go to delete the virtual machine, oh, I guess I need to delete this and this, the storage account, the IP. It's really difficult to manage. With ARM, everything is an individual resource, but we can bundle them together into resource groups. And if you delete a resource group, all of the assets that are associated with that resource group go bye-bye as well. So it's nice architecture. The APIs use JSON instead of XML for the payload, which you might agree with me. JSON's a heck of a lot easier to read than XML is, not to mention just more lightweight and network friendly. The REST APIs that you can get to in ARM are really nice. The portal experience, the PowerShell that we'll do tonight, there's a cross-platform CLI that is in version 2 now, and like Microsoft likes to do sometimes, there's V1 of the CLI and V2, and they're incompatible, so go figure. And then there's the software development kits for .NET and a whole bunch of other languages. We've got role-based access control. With Azure V1 or the service management, you're either an administrator, a co-administrator, or pretty much nothing. With RBAC, you can really be granular about who can do what in your system. And then finally, we have this cool thing called ARM templates, where every deployment, even if you do it in the portal, behind the scenes, you've got these JSON templates that are declaratively defining what your assets are. Like I said, it could be virtual machines, but it could be web apps, it could be machine learning experiments. I mean, whatever service Azure offers, behind the scenes, it's defined in JSON. And working with those templates is really powerful. I mean, if you've tried to do more complex deployments in Azure Service Management, it's serial. So if you need to deploy 5 virtual machines, you do the first one, then do the second one, then do the third one. It's horrible. With ARM, you could do it all at once in parallel. So as you can see, the long story short is that ARM is a much better deployment vehicle. So when you go to the portal, make sure to go to portal.azure.com and not manage.windowsazure.com. I think Microsoft would like to say goodbye to Azure V1, but there's, I guess, plenty of people still reliant upon it. Any questions or comments so far? The next piece to set the table here is a diagram that I borrowed from the Azure docs. The attribution link is in the corner. And these resources are defined in the API as resource providers. So they're grouped. They're disaggregated, I guess is the correct term. So the storage resource provider is where your storage stuff goes. And in the context of a virtual machine, you have your storage account, and your VHD files, your OS disk and data disk, are stored as blobs or binary large objects. The compute resource provider is where you define your VMs and something called an availability set that helps you do high availability. For instance, if in the Azure data center in your region, if there was a rack failure, you wouldn't want your VM to go offline with the rack. So if you use availability sets and you deploy multiple instances of your VMs and they're in the same availability set, the Azure team guarantees that, a rack failure won't affect you. That's the nutshell summary anyway. The network resource providers where a lot of moving parts exist, and I guess from what Microsoft tells me, where most of their support issues come from. You've got the network interface, the virtual NIC, that can be detached or reattached to one or different virtual machines. That NIC is going to have static or dynamic IP addresses associated with it. It's also connected potentially to a firewall called an NSG, a software firewall. Your VMs get placed into a virtual network, which in turn consists of one or more subnets. And you've got DNS name resolution out of the box within a VNet, but a confusing point is you actually need something like a site-to-site or VNet-to-VNet VPN if you have VMs in separate virtual networks. Again, there's more complexity than we need to worry about here. And then ultimately, in the IaaS or infrastructure as a service scenario, your VMs get out into the internet, potentially with a load balancer if you need one. Again, all this is software-defined networking that comes part of Azure. So I show you this because in our first demo, we're going to deploy a VM and you're going to see all of these parts in action. So I just wanted to put it in context, really. Another point, if you've been in the Azure ARM portal, portal.azure.com, and do a search, let me bring my mouse out here. I hate to call things out with my mouse, but the global search, if you type Resource Explorer, you can actually take a look at some of the resource paths in their application programming interface. And you can see it uses a very similar namespace construct to say .NET or any object-oriented programming language. You have the namespace Microsoft.compute, and then under compute, there's disks, images, virtual machines, scale sets, blah, blah, blah. And then you can actually view the definitions. Here in this screenshot, we're looking at availability set locations. And it can be helpful to inspect these paths when you're doing PowerShell because you may want to get a list of options, especially for your ARM templates, perhaps more than PowerShell. For an enumeration like locations, you'd like to know, is it South Central US or S Central US or just, you know what I'm saying, that kind of stuff. So I just mentioned that to you as an exploration tool in Azure as you're getting into this thing. Well, I guess I do have some callouts. I forgot about them. So again, as a quick first demo, I wanted to set the table before we do PowerShell, just if you haven't done a VM deployment in the portal, just to quickly show you that and how that fits into this notion of Azure Resource Manager templates. In the portal here, I'm going to come over to virtual machines, and we're just going to buzz through a quick deployment here. I'll click Add, and that'll connect us to the Azure Marketplace. And once it loads, I'm going to grab Windows Server 2016. I'm just going to do a search. And we'll grab, let's see, the data center plain vanilla image. Give that a click, and you'll notice that for some assets you can deploy to the old Azure V1. It's called Classic, but we want to stick with Resource Manager here. And there's 4 steps. The first one is simply giving a unique name for the virtual machine. It's going to need to be a unique name, globally unique, AZPosh VM001. And that checked out okay. I'll leave with solid state storage, and you can't use admin or administrator as a username. You have to have a pretty long password for the template to pass validation. Retype that. Subscription, resource group, we can reuse an existing one if we have one or create a new one. And then, of course, a location that's presumably geographically close to your users or where you are. Second choice, you may recall, you choose a size. One of the great benefits of the public cloud is that you don't have to go through the requisition process for new hardware, get it approved and budgeted, send it, rack it, stack it, blah, blah, blah. You can just, with a line of PowerShell or a couple clicks of the mouse, scale up or down as you need to. This is really cool. I didn't expect that this had GA'd so suddenly. This is a big change right here on step 3, where this is the main confusing point for Azure customers too, by the way. Storage account to store your VHDs, or check this out, manage disks. This is a brand new feature. It's supposed to GA tomorrow actually, but anyway, it allows you to do a more of a turnkey management of your VHDs, whereas with a storage account rather, there's lots to get confused with in there because there's blob storage and queues and tables and this, that, and the other. Managed disks is pretty slick. The template in Azure, the templates, I should say, for virtual machines will deploy a new unique virtual network, subnet, dynamic public IP address, and generic network security group if you just click, next kind of thing. And I'm actually going to do that here in the interest of time. The NSG, as I said earlier, is the software firewall. And for Windows images, you're going to need to have an inbound rule for 3389. And if we're going to do PowerShell remoting, what will we have to do here? We'll have to create a new inbound rule. It's a trivia question. What TCP port will we need for PowerShell remoting? Anybody know? Anyone? Bueller?
We were muted.
Oh, are you muted? Okay. Okay, I'm like.
5985, isn't it? Or 86?
There you go. Yeah, 5985 or 5986, whether you're doing SSL or not, exactly. But this one's okay, so I'm going to close the blades there. I'll leave the defaults for monitoring and diagnostic and the diagnostic storage account. And then here's really what I wanted to show you. If the deployment passes the validation against the ARM schema, whatever API version is the current one in here anyway, you can click OK to push the deployment, or check this out. Download template and parameters. And if you give that a click, it opens the underlying template up in a separate blade where you can view the different resources that make up this deployment. Here should be pretty easy to see. We've got a virtual machine, we've got a storage account for our diagnostics, a virtual network, a VNIC, a public IP address, and an NSG. And you can get to and modify the underlying JSON directly from in here. And check this out too. We can look at deployment options for different languages. For instance, for PowerShell, this code is actually suited to this template directly. And you could literally just click to deploy without having to modify it at all, potentially. You can store the template in the Azure cloud here with that click, that save to library option. Or you can download directly to your system. It comes down as a simple zip file. I'm going to bring that down to my desktop. And we'll look at that in the next demo. But again, this is just to underscore the fact that all the work you do here is using these JSON templates. It reminds me of other Windows abstractions, like when you're in Control Panel and clicking around, you've got registry values and keys being manipulated. And actually, for that matter, PowerShell, right, where we're abstracting away .NET classes and methods and yada yada. Questions, comments, concerns, curiosities?
Is it Python?
Pardon?
Is Python one of those languages?
Yes, it is actually. They do support Python. Mm-hmm.
Hey,
In fact,
you save the template, where does it put it?
where does it put it? Well, you mean if you save it in the portal or if you download it?
Where does it put it in the portal?
I think it's in a node called templates. I'm doing a search. Yeah, it's in public preview, as you can see. It says templates preview. But this is where any templates that you choose to save in the portal will get stored. I haven't checked this out in a while. Just for grins, let's click add and see what kind of trouble we can get in. Okay, general, it wants a unique name and a description. That makes sense. But what about the ARM template piece? It just gives you a naked viewer screen. Okay, I was hoping it would give us a link to what are called the Azure Quick Start templates. Those are awfully useful, and if you don't know what those are, hang on because I'll show them to you in just a moment. Let's see, what's next here? Getting productive with Azure PowerShell. Okay, first of all, how do you get the ARM modules if you don't already have them? One is to go to the Azure SDKs and Tools webpage and just click download, and it uses the web platform installer, as you can see here. It's a pretty handy way to keep the module updated, actually, because it seems like almost every time I think to fire up the PI on my system, there's a new release of Azure PowerShell and maybe even the Azure command line interface. To your point about Python, the Azure CLI v1 is a Node.js application. Azure CLI v2 is a Python application, interestingly enough. In PowerShell, if you have the package management stuff installed, find module, name Azure RM. Note that it's not name Azure. The Azure module is the Azure v1 stuff, the legacy, the classic, whatever you want to call it. And one of many weaknesses of that module is that all of the service management commandlets are packed into that single module. If you install from the command line here, all you need to install is Azure RM, because it's actually a bootstrapper that will then in turn cascade and install the rest of the Azure RM modules. Because like I said, it's been componentized. So there'll be an Azure RM.compute module that has virtual machine commandlets. There's an Azure RM.profile that has the login and authentication commandlets in it. But this is what you need. And I ran this particular pipeline just to show you, the rapid development there. As of the screenshot, January 18th, version 3.4.0, and just since last fall, look at how many releases there have been. So Microsoft is certainly upholding that DevOps, continuous delivery, continuous integration motif themselves, which can be pretty frustrating. Are we agreed? Jeez, you write a script and then you find out that something on the PowerShell side and their release is broken your script. That's a pretty common thing, isn't it? The next demo is, let's just do a little discovery here in the Azure RM modules and commands and look at deploying a VM programmatically. Let me pop open my PowerShell ISE. Once again, these script files are both in that repo. I'll show you the URL if you forgot at the end of the presentation. But this first script, I should say, deploy Linux VM PS. I guess I do a Linux VM, not that it really matters. I start off just for grins, declaring some variables for my subscription name, the resource group name I want to use here, the storage account I'll use. We won't use managed disks here. We'll use the traditional storage account. And I'm in the South Central US, so I want that to be my location. The way to do a programmatic logon, if you don't already know, in ARM is log in Azure RM account. So I'm going to put in my Microsoft ID here. You can authenticate with an Azure AD account that's in a subscription already, or I'm doing Microsoft account. Got my two-factor thing happening here. I didn't think I'd have to do this, but let me quickly pop in my little code here. Being a Pluralsight trainer, it's crucial that I do stuff like two-factor auth, and because, as you can imagine, I've got people trying to hammer my account all the time. Thinking they watch one of my videos and think, I wonder if he's still got this online. Hammer, hammer, hammer. That's not that fun. Okay, we can verify our environment here. It looks like I'm tied to the correct subscription. That's fine. I don't have a current storage account in my session, but that's easy to fix. Set Azure RM context can make sure that we're attached to the proper subscription, because I do actually have several subscriptions on this account. Set Azure RM current storage account. Passing in a storage account name will associate your session with a particular storage account if you need it. I don't here. Basic PowerShell, the root part of the noun is Azure RM. The Azure v1 stuff, it's just Azure, like get Azure VM. In ARM, it's get Azure RM VM. But there's some annoying inconsistencies, as there always is, right? Where there's a few ARM commands that don't use the RM, which can be kind of confusing. Let's see, what are we doing here on line 25? Just doing some basic gets here. So get against Azure RM.star, where I'm doing first a measure object just for grins to see what exactly do they have. Almost 1,500 commandlets across the Azure RM modules right now. That's pretty crazy. If we get module, looking at Azure RM, profile and resources. That's kind of weird. There's a lot more than that. Maybe we got to do that module auto loading thing in order to, I should have done like a list available, but whatever, it doesn't matter. This is just fun stuff, really. Looking at the commands in a particular module like Azure RM Compute, you should see the standard practices, the approved verbs. And if you have done work with Azure V1, you should find that the commandlets are largely the same or similar. You know, the gets, the news, the start, stops, updates. It's just, in many cases, it's just the RM instead of Azure RM. It's now Azure RM VM. And there's some cool stuff that's not available in Azure V1 that you can do here, like with scale sets. And there's better commandlet support for virtual machine extensions and stuff like that. Just for grins, if you haven't done security principal authentication, this is a link to a documentation article that's pretty good. And what I'm talking about here is you might have an ARM deployment script, PowerShell script, and you don't want to do the login Azure RM and do an interactive logon. What you can do, what this tutorial shows you how to do, is to create an Azure AD credential in your subscription and use the Azure Key Vault to store the credentials. And then in your script, you can securely authenticate and do your work programmatically and automatically by having Azure fetch the credentials securely. Because, of course, number one, we in many cases don't want to have to nursemaid at the keyboard. And number two, at all costs, we want to avoid putting credentials in plain text. Now, let me CLS down at the bottom. Any questions so far? Okay. Without getting in the weeds here, I'll just try to stick to the general theme. How do we deploy a virtual machine in ARM working up into the templates? This is just naked PowerShell. I've thrown in some helpful, at least I hope they're helpful, gets to help you with stuff like, well, I know I need a location. What are my options? Or there's so many different VM templates in the gallery. How do I know what such and so template is called? Get Azure RM location is good for looking up your region. To create a new resource group, very simple there. You just need a resource group name string and a location. To create a traditional storage account, there's a little bit more to that because you might know there's different stock keeping units or SKUs for storage. I think this is an enumeration. Let me quickly check that. Whoops. Yeah, it is. Good. So let me see if IntelliSense can drop that down. Here we go. So for the different replication options for storage accounts, one of the nice things, of course, about ISE is that it can help you know which one is called. And so that's a kind and a location, blah, blah, blah. I'm actually going to run these as we go along. I hope I don't skip one. Here I'm setting our storage account to the one that we just created. The next few lines, we're going into the storage account and plucking the security key, the private key that's associated with the storage account. And the reason why we need that in the context of creating a VM is that the storage context, which in Azure is the storage account and its private key, is used by Azure in the VM building process. So that's to get us started, I guess. Created a storage account, fetched the key. We have a resource group. The subnet, as you can see, new Azure RM Virtual Network subnet config. Say that 5 times quickly. Give that a friendly name and an address pool prefix. Another variable to create the virtual network itself. It's all linked together like Tinker Toys, really. You're working through a process of building up the virtual network configuration, component by component. The subnet, the virtual network, depending upon whether you want a static or dynamic public IP, all Azure RM virtual machines are going to need a public IP address. That's a difference between Azure V1 and Azure V2. The network interface, again, the thigh bone is connected to the knee bone, and then, you know, that sort of business comes in. Supplying, I use get credential here as an example where we'd have to interactively provide the local administrator name and password. Another get here to get the Azure RM VM sizes. The output here is pretty useful, actually. As you can see, it gives you the name, which what you really need for your code. but it can give you at a glance the CPU cores, the virtual RAM, the number of additional data disks besides the OS disks you can have, and so on and so forth. Then in this my VM variable, I'm starting to gradually, like a snowball rolling downhill, aggregate all these different components together. Again, this example is a Linux VM, but it really doesn't matter because we use the same commands for Windows Server VMs or Linux VMs. We get the Azure Image Publisher. That's what this get is all about. Let's run that. I'm looking for just the publisher name here. And this is a pretty huge list because we have to remember that there's virtual machine appliances by Azure partners, and there's several approved or endorsed Linux distributions. So the idea here is you just want to find the string that matches what you need. In my example, I'm using Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Let's see. Get Azure RM VM image SKU is going to give you for a specific publisher the specific images and paths to those generalized images, which version you want. Little bit of fuddy-duddy work here associating your virtual network and your VNIC and building your OS disk. And then, believe it or not, I'm sure I may be preaching to the proverbial choir. You may have already done this hundreds of times for all I know. All of this code comes down to a single line here on line 80. New Azure RM VM specifying a resource group name, a location, and then the configuration that we've been building over the previous couple dozen lines of code. Crazy how that works. So that's just the naked PowerShell approach. If you have to do Azure V1, and if you have done it, it's pretty much the same process. I mean, basically, actually, let me take that back. It's not the same process because Azure V1 doesn't have the concept of the NIC. It does a lot of stuff that's different, come to think of it. It's been a while since I've had to worry about the Azure V1 stuff. So stepping into ARM templates into a little bit greater depth. You like that? Stepping into, I had to do that. There's certain things that you have to go there. Like earlier when the kind lady, your sponsor, was talking about letting the dogs out. You just can't let stuff go. Are we agreed? Some laundry list of ARM template facts. Every Azure deployment uses these. Already been there, done that, bought the t-shirt. Deterministic. So the idea here is that each time you've worked out a template, every time you run it, it should give you the expected result. There should be no surprises. Another $5 term that's often said in the same breath as deterministic is idempotent. What does that mean? Second trivia question of the night. I wish I had a prize for the correct answer, though.
I have a prize.
Awesome. A slice of pizza?
No, I have something in my bag I can give away, unless somebody's already got it.
Idempotent means it's going to never come back, right?
No, it means it can be reused, right? Isn't that what it is?
Yeah, I like to describe it as it's not going to, well, that's not a good way of describing it. I'm not going to get the prize. Idempotent means if you're right. If your deployment bombs out halfway through and you rerun it, it's not going to redo stuff that's already completed successfully. So let's say you have an ARM template that creates a virtual network with 2 subnets, and then you decide to add a 3rd subnet to your template. You can actually rerun that same template again, and Azure's smart enough to detect, well, it's going to do what's ever in the template. So if I deleted one of the subnets that was defined originally in the template, it's going to recreate it because anything that's in that template is what's going to happen. But it's going to skip over stuff that's already there. So that's essentially what we're talking about.
So it's almost transactional.
Yeah, I like that. Transactional. It's going to do its best. Azure's going to do its best not to leave your environment in an inconsistent state. Parameters and variables and functions are all allowed and encouraged in ARM templates. And parameters, as you know, is going to make our templates easier to reuse. Variables, as you know, probably is going to be for data that will be referred to several times over the course of a deployment. And you saw in that PowerShell a moment ago, there was a lot that where the same variable kept getting reused over and over and over again. With Azure, oftentimes you run up against issues with globally unique names. If you're not using a custom DNS name for your blob storage, for instance, you're going to have to find a globally unique storage account name under the blobcorewindows.net, I think is the DNS domain. So there's functions that allow you to generate unique items. You can concatenate strings together. There's lots of neat applications of using some of the built-in functions in ARM. And then even more complex is the ability to nest templates and have dependencies between different components. So you might have a template that defines the network and another one that deploys a VM scale set, let's say, and you can actually nest them together. That's not something I've had to get into myself, but it's definitely powerful, but it's more accessible than you might think at first blush. Even IT pros, I hope, many are using Visual Studio. And from what I understand, having my ear to the ground, Visual Studio is going to become increasingly IT pro friendly over time. Because the Azure team and the VS team and the PowerShell team all know that I say we, as a sysadmin IT pro person, am not going to need 90% of what's in Visual Studio, but Visual Studio does have, if you have the Azure.NET SDK installed, built-in support for ARM templates. So this screenshot shows the new template dialog. This is Visual Studio 2015 that I'm showing. This applies not only to the retail versions, but also Visual Studio Community Edition, the free version. So the Azure SDK gives us this cloud category in the template gallery. And in there's an Azure Resource Group template. And I presume, although I haven't tested it, so I don't want to speak definitively, that the other SDKs like Python and Java and PHP and all of this, you have the same option there, but I'm not sure. In a sense, it doesn't matter because remember, these templates are JSON anyway, but the ability to get to it from within Visual Studio might be useful for you, if for no other reason that we have IntelliSense and we have validation and a lot of nice source control plugins, this kind of thing. If you choose that project type, this is the next dialog that pops up, and I want to draw your attention to this thing here, the Azure Quick Start. It's going to filter your view to show you the featured ARM templates from the Azure Quick Start gallery. And what's important about that is that the featured templates have been personally vetted and validated by the Azure development team to follow their patterns and practices. The rest of the Quick Start gallery is kind of a Wild West, sort of like the PowerShell gallery when you think about it. Let me go there, actually. Let me do a search for Azure. And there's a public page and the underlying GitHub repo. If you've never been there, this is a super important page for you to study and to spend time in if you haven't done ARM templates yet. And let's see if there's an easier way to get to the featured ones here. I don't know. They've got it sorted on most popular, but that's unfortunate. That in Visual Studio, it'll show you the ones, like I said, that have been validated as opposed to just ones that Joe or Jane, administrator, may have uploaded themselves. But anyway, the idea here is that you should be able to search for what you're doing, like virtual machine. And let's see if there's anything. VM scale set with auto scale rules. So you go to the page, and there'll be a description of the parameters, how it's parameterized, a brief description of what it does. And then there's normally some helpful links, a PowerShell one-liner. The commandlet to do an ARM template deployment is new Azure RM Resource Group deployment. And for the Azure v1, they have the code here. Azure v2, it's AZ and not Azure. That's how I could tell that. And then the buttons are awfully helpful. There's a deploy to Azure, which will, if you're already logged into the portal in that browser session and can read your cookie, it'll actually log into the portal and open up the deployment screen automatically. And any defaults that have been populated in the template will show up. Any enumerations that have been declared in the template will show up here as well. So it's an easier way to get started with one of those quick start templates. The Browse on GitHub option, of course, will open up github.com into the Azure Quick Start Templates gallery. And there, you hopefully will find some documentation. You'll have the underlying source files. In addition to that funky Deploy to Azure button, there's a Visualize button. And if you've never seen the Resource Visualizer before, or ARMViz tool, this is awesome. This is really cool. Now, I don't like the latest version, if for no other reason the text is like appropriate for an ant, maybe. And even when you zoom in, it's really clunky. I'm used to using the original ARMViz. Fortunately, it's still up. You click looking for the previous version. It's old.armviz.io. And boy, is this a useful tool, because you can actually load your own template into here. You see over on the left, we've got Open Existing Template, which is going to browse. You can browse your system for that. You can load a template directly from the Azure Quick Start gallery here. You can whatever you're working on in your workspace, you can download it to your computer. And then there's a Deploy to Azure button right here as well. Let me zoom in a little bit. One nice thing off the top is that it's going to show you graphically the resources that are in the template. When you double left click, it shows you the underlying JSON. And this is actually, is it? Yeah, it's editable. So you can work in here and validate, save, delete your work as you go on. For parameterizing the template, any existing parameters that are in the definition show up here. And notice how easy it is to plug in default values and enumerations, which are technically called allowed values. And we can add additional parameters here. So this is more than a like look and enjoy kind of thing. This is something you actually can use to build your own templates and then say download them to your system or re-upload them, whatever. It's an awesome tool that I wanted you to be aware of. Any questions, comments, concerns?
We're good.
Okay.
Is there any way you can lobby to have this old version back?
Could you repeat the question, please? It broke up.
And you can lobby to have this old version back? The GUI that you're modifying, that you're looking at?
Well, I mean, it's here, right? I mean, you've got the so-called new version, and then we can go to the old version. Are you wondering, is there a way we can ensure this version isn't going away?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell them. I'll tell them myself. I agree. I'm surprised I haven't read or heard more about this newer portal, but anyway. Okay, where did we leave off? Okay, the end of this little process here is that once you've loaded up an ARM template project in Visual Studio, you'll see in the Solution Explorer, you have a templates node that has your actual JSON files. And the two main ones are called Azure Deploy.json, and then there's your parameters.json file. Optionally, you can have a manifest file that's, in my impression, more for documentation purposes. But the Azure Deploy.json is where the guts of the deployment are stored. And of course, parameters are where your parameters are. And the Visual Studio SDK gives you a PS1 deployment file, handy dandy, along with that solution. Okay, Azure Resource Explorer, ARM template, Visual Studio. Okay, so I've showed you a lot of this. Let me minimize and come out to our desktop here. And earlier, I downloaded the template from the ARM portal. The contents of that, no surprise, are the parameters and template JSON files, and then there's helper file. Excuse me, deployment helper files. There's a C#, a Ruby, a Bash shell script, and then there's a PS1 script file. It's really nice. So it's kind of an all-in-one box kind of deal for downloading those from the portal. In Visual Studio Code, if you haven't done this, I would suggest that you, first of all, make sure that you've updated it to the latest version, and it'll have a little flyout for extensions. There's some cool extensions for Azure and PowerShell development. There's the PowerShell extension. And then for Azure, I have a couple of those installed. There's, let's see, the Azure Extension Pack is good, and Azure Resource Manager Tools. And then, again, I don't want to get lost in the weeds with step-by-step. I have all this stuff documented for you. But under Preferences, User Snippets, it's wise to download the JSON snippet file that the Azure team has online, because by installing the PowerShell and Azure extensions into VS Code, and B, installing this pre-done collection of JSON snippets, the long story short is you get your IntelliSense code complete and validation help with your ARM templates, all from Visual Studio Code. Just as a quick backup on that, let me show you. In the repo, the Timothy Warner User Group's AZPosh 2017 folder, in that links list document that I give you, let me see where it is. Here it is right here on lines 15 through 17. This documentation article gives you the step-by-step on setting up Visual Studio Code for good use in PowerShell scripting, script development, and ARM template development. Okay. Let's see. Speaking of template deployment, another PowerShell script that I have for you that might be helpful just walks through the basic how-to, assuming that you've got some template files on your local system that you might have downloaded from the gallery or even done from scratch, who knows. But I have here, let's see, bring them into my space here. I've got my Azure deploy.json and Azure deploy.parameters.json. These come from one of the quick start template items, the one I think it's called Deploy a Simple Windows VM. I wanted to try to find the most simple option I could for easier study. And this one doesn't parameterize a whole lot. The parameters.json file has key value pairs for the built-in admin, for the admin's password, and for the virtual machine's host name, okay? And I'm just statically coding those, including, dangerously enough, a static password, which, as we've talked about, isn't a good idea, period, across the board to do that. The way to do this, again, securely, is to include a reference to Key Vault, to an Azure AD credential in your code. And I didn't include that in this demo because it's too complex. But in that links list, there is a doc link that shows you how to do that as well. Okay, so that's just the parameter option. And ideally, whatever your deployment is, you shouldn't have to mess with the Azure deploy.json file too much. You should be able to just customize the bulk of it by modifying only the parameters, which should make perfect sense to you just from a scripting and administrative automation standpoint. This particular template for a simple Windows virtual machine is cool because the author included description fields, which makes it a little bit easier to see. What else do we have here? Are there any defaults? Yes, there are. Helpfully, for things like the Windows OS version, the author added on line 25 a key value pair for default value. And there's also an allowed values enumeration, which can be helpful when you do want to run the script again, and maybe you're going to do a 2016 Nano server instead of a Server 2016 Data Center Edition box. So the defaults can be useful. We might decide, for instance, to add a default to the DNS name. I know that probably isn't the most logical thing to do, but I'm going to do it here just for grins. Default value, quote, and then something like that. Make sure to add a comma there. Nice thing that VS Code and Visual Studio has is the ability to validate the template against the ARM schema. I don't think out of the box, in fact, I know ISE isn't going to do that out of the box. There may be an ISE extension that allows that, but I don't know off the top of my head. All right, so anyway, messing with the template and the parameters there. Let's see. Oh, here's that documentation link to fetch the password from the Key Vault. Read the RTFM. The F can stand for whatever you want. Just wanted to throw this in. Are you all familiar with the show window switch on Get Help or Help? When I teach, I always like to throw this in, not to insult anybody's intelligence, but boy, it's helpful if you work with a multi-monitor setup. Assuming that there is a help file, one thing you're going to find with the ARM commandlets, if you haven't already found out, is that some of them are not only lightly documented, but just there ain't nothing there. That's kind of disheartening to see that. But show window, as you see, will put the entire file in a separate window, including good old examples. So the example that I have here is new Azure RM resource group deployment. This is going to be, the name is just the friendly name for the deployment. It's always going to, Azure's going to give it a globally unique deployment ID itself. This is for your own sanity. The resource group name, whatever that is. And then you have flexibility as far as pointing to your Azure deploy.json and your Azure template, your parameter.json, excuse me. I've commented out these two lines because I wanted to show you the options here. In ISE, you see that there's template file and template URI, and template parameter file and template parameter URI. So the great beauty here is you don't have to work necessarily from your local machine. You could supply a URI to your source code repository and just keep your code where it belongs in source code control and just run your command and point to it, you see. So I just wanted to make sure to throw that in as an option. And then as expected, you could launch the verbose stream to get a better idea of what PowerShell is doing. And then it does do a what if, which is again a nice sanity check. Not foolproof, as you know, but a nice sanity check. What else do we have for you? Gee, I don't know if it's good, bad, or indifferent, but I'm winding up here. I was going to give you a book reference because I'm always learning via books and websites. But you know, Azure is a terrible subject for a book because once you capture any technology in a book and it goes to the printer, it's going to be obsolete in the matter of days or weeks. And in Azure, it's probably going to start to get obsolete within 24 hours. So you'll find, if you haven't already, that Azure books, there's some nice ones. There's an O'Reilly book called Azure Automation, but he's using Azure V1. So it's of limited use for Resource Manager and certainly for Resource Manager templates. I would suggest you spend time, if you're not already there, at the docs library. You may have noticed that Microsoft's been porting their TechNet and MSDN docs to a central URL. It's docs.microsoft.com. And docs.microsoft.com/Azure is what this screenshot is, and it's pretty cool, I think. There's some glitches. You'll find an occasional redirect problem, but it's really nice, especially the text is probably too small for you to see, maybe not, but those three buttons up on top, those getting started links, there's one for developers and one for IT operators. Those are especially good, I think. All right, let's see here. The materials, again, are at timw.info/AZPosh. My Twitter handle is TechTrainerTim. You can contact me via email. Perhaps from my blog is the most straightforward method, azuredepot.com/contact. With that, I just want to thank you again for having me. I hope that this made some semblance of sense. And I'm more than happy to entertain any comments or questions or concerns. If I can answer, I will. And if I can't, I'll get an answer and I'll add an update to that AZPosh repository. I'll put a text file in there that you can check in a day or two. Thank you.
Hey, you're not leaving yet, right?
No, I don't have to leave yet.
Okay.
You have any pizza left over or no?
Yeah, we'll email you.
There you go. But I'm the kind of person that I would probably eat the pizza if you sent it through the mail, so whatever.
Hey, can we see your face again?
You can't. Oh, right. I'm sharing the screen. I forgot all about that. Okay. Let's see here.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. Do we have any questions on the floor here? Anybody have anything for Tim?
Are any of you doing this stuff each day? Are any of you working with ARM templates now? And if so, what are your pain points, or what are especially cool things about it that you want to share? I'm really curious to know myself.
I wish.
I can speak up. I can tell you what I'm doing.
Yeah, Tom, definitely.
I've been working a lot with platform as a service,
Mm-hmm.
which that's what we use right now at Pulte.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what I've been doing is working with a lot of the, alerting and instrumentation of things that you have inside of Azure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And not so much with the templates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when you think of the templates, it's deployment, isn't it? And if you've already laid down the infrastructure, you're probably not going to need to recreate said infrastructure. So I guess it is kind of a special case. How about Azure PowerShell in general and Azure V1 versus V2? Have any of you bumped up against any of those pain points?
Not yet.
How popular is Azure in the Tempe, Phoenix region, by the way? Here in Nashville, it's not really a big thing.
I don't think it's caught on really that much
Yeah.
yet.
I think we're still Amazon at this point.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It might be an industry thing partially. Here in Nashville, of course, there's the music business, but there's a lot of healthcare and a lot of legal. So I think a lot of businesses just rule out any public cloud because of compliance and security. But they don't understand that both Amazon and Microsoft have devoted a lot of money and effort to just about any government or industry compliance certification imaginable. And you can choose where your data is. It's not like your data is automatically going to be replicated to another country and you don't know what your sovereignty situation is. So,
We had a question back here. Go ahead, Mike.
okay.
Can you pull up that script again?
Mm-hmm.
Built the VM.
Okay.
We're gonna have to screen share. Wow.
Scroll down. I think it was like $myVM or something.
Yeah, the configuration. That started, I think, on line 65.
Like 65, 67. So I'm curious how that's working. Shouldn't you have to do like a plus equals or something to add to that myVM or?
I don't remember what .NET object type myVM is at this point, but PowerShell is smart enough to understand that it's just adding on to an existing object. I see what you're saying. You would expect that you'd want to be explicit and do like, take this object and now explicitly add this next piece. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah. What version are you running? 5?
Yeah, I'm using WMF 5.5.0, I believe. This is a Windows 8.1 machine that you're looking at right now.
Where's the first line that you mentioned, the myVM, where you create that object?
Let's see. Yep, that actually comes into play here on this line. New
Like
Azure.
on line 67, you reference it -VM. I wonder if that's where it's like referencing it and then making it equal. So you're actually overwriting it. That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah, because it runs the right on the.
And down below it does.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
So it is overwriting it then. It's not. It's
So
not
it's
Right.
just a different object then.
Yeah, it's not that Azure isn't smart enough to do it. It's that I'm not smart enough to realize that. It's an override. Thank you for mentioning that. I haven't thought about that deeply. I just think of the metaphor of a snowball rolling downhill. I guess that's not good enough.
Can you run line 65 and see what it equals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a PS virtual machine object at that point. And then we're, redefining the variable, saying now set the operating system of this virtual machine object with the string name myLinuxVM. It's using Linux. This is a switch, Linux or Windows. and the administrator credential will be what we defined here.
What does $myVM equal right now? Like,
Yep. Let me try.
Can you pull out any of the properties of it to see it, like what the default operating system would be or something like that, or the default computer name? Is it just all blank? Or
Not at this point, because we're just using
already did
ad
it?
hoc PowerShell. There's no underlying template definition. So I ran it into format list star, and all it knows at this point is the name we gave it. Hardware profile is just generic Azure Management Compute Models hardware profile. So it's really generic at this point. Wonder if we have to add some uniqueness there to this line. Whoops. Cannot get.
Oh, you don't have your credential.
Yeah, log it in.
That's right. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so it's attached to an OS profile object because I've supplied credentials, but it's still pretty nascent. In other words, it looks like it's still pretty embryonic at this point. So once we've determined an image publisher and an image SKU, it looks like we redefine the variable on 73 and 74, supplying the publisher name, the offer, which is, I guess, the OS from that publisher, the version, and then we add the network interface that we would have already had to create earlier. And then adding the OS disk static name, and then pathing out to where the VHD will be under your blob core Windows Net namespace. And then this assumes that I've already created a container in my storage account called VHDs, and I'm naming the VHD like this. And I'm creating it from a predefined image.
Thanks. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. What else?
So these images of the OSs, are they stored within the cloud itself, like the Linux one and stuff like that, or do you have to upload them to use them? Or can you upload them if you
You
want
can
to
do
use a
both.
specific image?
Yeah, good question. Good question. Yeah, you can do both. From the portal, remember the first thing we did when we created a new VM is we looked at the gallery. And when you do that, when you go into the gallery, like here, see all, I mean, it shows you could search or just browse through here. You can get to all these predefined images in PowerShell. Unfortunately, your custom images, you're going to need to use PowerShell for that. So for instance, you might have an Azure VM and you generalize it, use sysprep, and then you could use, I think it's save Azure RM VM to save that generalized image, and it won't be visible in the portal. So in order to create a new VM with that image, you'll have to use PowerShell or the Azure CLI. But yes, you absolutely can store your own custom images in Azure in addition or instead of using these pre-done ones. Of course, the advantage of the pre-done ones is that licensing is built in. So for instance, the Windows Server images, the per minute runtime is going to include your server license as well as your client access licenses, which is pretty cool. For the Linux distros, it depends on which one. For Red Hat, there's a separate charge. There's the per minute runtime, and then Red Hat wants their 2 cents. So there's an additional runtime charge for their licensing, for their, you know how they make their money with their support agreements. But for other free and open source like Ubuntu or CentOS, that's completely free. You're paying a per minute runtime, but that's just you're paying Microsoft for doing the heavy lifting of hosting the VM, but you're not paying for the OS license itself. And then you notice the different partners like Veeam and so forth. There it depends. You could bring your own license and just apply it to the VM yourself, or sometimes it's included in the per minute runtime. It's just like anything else. Read the instructions, read the manual. You'll notice in the portal, it says right here, bring your own license enabled. You'll do that, for instance, for Oracle database. Would be a good example of where you'd need to supply your own license, your own very expensive Oracle database license.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And lots of consultants.
Yeah, those consultants make a nice amount of bank too, don't they? In fact, I learned recently that Oracle, no surprise I'm sure, is in the public cloud space. I think their service is called, imaginatively enough, Oracle Cloud. And they don't really play well with others, though, so I'm going to be interested to see. They're probably just going to offer their own line of business apps. I think they own PeopleSoft and a bunch of other, like CRM kind of stuff. But at least here with the new Microsoft, I'm proud of them, really, for having Linux and working so well with partners. It is to their advantage, of course, to do that, but it's nice that we have so much cross-platform. Tom, you mentioned Linux running, or PowerShell engine being available on Linux and Mac OS. That's another good example of that.
Anybody else? We got a quiet crowd tonight, Tim.
Yeah, it seems like it. And as an instructor, it's one of those things you're never quite sure. What are they thinking? I'm not there in person, so you can't take me out back, but I hope that this presentation was useful.
Will you be going to the conference this year?
Well, it depends on the conference. I'm going to speak at the PowerShell and DevOps Summit, which I think is in April. Both tech mentors. There's a tech mentor in Redmond in the early fall, and in Florida, I think in January of next year. And let's see, there's one, Dev Intersections. The IT Pro part of Dev Intersections is called, I guess, IT Intersections. And that's going to be, I don't remember if it's Las Vegas or Orlando, but those are my conferences for this year at this point. Next one up, I think, is the PowerShell and DevOps Summit, which is a really great experience.
Hey, if there's a availability in October, would you be willing to come speak here for a Saturday event?
Yeah, I've never been to Arizona and always wanted to visit. I mean, you're in Tempe right now, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
I've known of Tempe.
Event, but
right, sure. Yeah. Because my cousin Kaz grew up in Tempe, and I'd see him every summer. And I mean, being a kid, Tempe, Arizona might as well have been east of Mars. It seems so exotic. Cacti and carrot and sand and I grew up in Syracuse, New York, so there's a lot of snow, ice, and gray skies.
So come in July.
The full experience coming in July.
you won't need that hat.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's pretty cold here in Nashville, and in this office building, my neighbor likes to crank down the temperature, hence the hat. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I don't know that we have very much more questions, Tim. I
Okay.
certainly do appreciate you taking time out of your day, and it's almost, 8 o'clock there?
Yeah, 8 o'clock. Time to go home to the fam, I think.
Okay, well, thanks so much for presenting on this topic and pitching in for us. We really do appreciate it. Love to have you again if you'd like to. So,
I look forward to it. Thanks a lot for having me, everybody. Have a great night.
all right. Thank
Stay in
you.
touch.